already in zip form, and the title of the form is General Information for Buyers and Sellers of Residential Real Property in San Francisco. Disclosures and Disclaimers Advisory. This particular form is very similar to the Contra Costa County as well as the Alameda County disclosures and advisory that I have covered within the last several weeks. So some of the things that we're already familiar, we're not going to spend time reviewing them, but I will go over the things that are unique to San Francisco. So as you can see in the table of content, the general advisories are very similar to the ones we already covered in Contra Costa and Alameda. Okay, you got the contract contingencies, probate sales, squad confirmation, title insurance and preliminary report, existing housing stock, floors and walls, tempered glass, condominiums, new construction warranties, defects, and lawsuits. The top 9 items have been covered in the other 2 forms, so I will not go over it. However, this rekeying is unique to this form. I will go over it. And then online photographs and videos, I believe that is also covered previously. Personal property and staging items, same thing. Fair housing and service animals. That one is also, it was also covered in the previous disclosure form for Contra Costa and Alameda County, so I will skip that. Same thing with crime, residential fireplace disclosure, wet weather conditions. So except for rekeying, which is number 10, 1 through 16 have been covered in prior form, so I will not go over it. And B has to do with everything that is unique in San Francisco. Pay attention, because one of these days you may become a listing agent for a property in San Francisco. You need to know what disclosures you need to provide and what inspection reports you need to have prepared. Now is a good time to learn this. Okay? Let me see what the background noise is, and see if I can go ahead and mute that. I think it's not over here. Nancy, it's you. All right, got Nancy Liu joining us. So now it's quiet. Great, thank you. Going back to the form again. Now we're just getting in the table of contents. I will spend a lot of time on B as opposed to A. A, I'm just going to be talking about rekeying because we didn't cover rekeying the last time. Okay? All right. So there's a bunch of stuff to cover in B, so let me go into it. Now let's go to 10 under A. Rekeying. Buyers advise that all logs should be rekeyed immediately upon close of escrow for buyer safety and security of their persons as well as their personal belongings. Even though the buyer will be receiving keys from the seller, certainly the buyer, for their own safety, wants to rekey every lock that they have in the house so that no one else has the key except for the buyers themselves. So this is just to advise them that they probably should think about rekeying their locks. And then the alarm should be serviced by professionals and the code should be changed. So if they have an existing alarm in the house, that alarm should be serviced by a professional. And they have to change the code so no one else has the code except for the new owners. Garage door openers and remote should be recoded. Same thing. This is to remind the buyer that they need to recode the garage door opener. Okay? Got it. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to B. And B is all San Francisco. B is all unique to San Francisco. So, you want to pay attention to B for today's training anyway. Okay? Yep, B is pretty, that's unique to San Francisco. Okay. First one is basically to advise the buyer of the climate condition in the Bay Area that sometimes they could have strong winds. Where I live in Brisbane, we get strong wind pretty much every afternoon. Strong wind, and we get fog as well. Okay? And salty sea mist, sea air and mist. So the buyer needs to be made aware of that. San Francisco Bay regulations. This one is talking about the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission being charged with the responsibility to restore the bay's wetlands and marshes. It will be important to buyers of properties close to these wetlands. New construction and development impact. This one is talking about possibly some new construction in the San Francisco area, and the buyer needs to be aware that there's some new construction in progress. And one of the tallest buildings in San Francisco area right now, rumors has it that it is tilting. Okay, not too many people know about it, but I heard some rumors. That's right. It's actually tilting a little bit, just so you know. Okay. All right. So they have structure. That's the tallest building in the city of San Francisco. Might be tilting a little bit. Okay. Subterranean issues. So this one is talking about, the San Francisco hills has active or potentially active landslide areas. So to warn the buyer that the only way to ensure that they don't have such problems on the property they're buying is to get a geology report or geotechnical inspection report prepared. Okay? There are always going to be such issue, but what can you do if you want to buy in San Francisco? And this one is also talking about some of the San Francisco cities underground sewer lines date back to over 100 years ago. So there are some of these pipes might be fractured. That might cause some collapse in parts of the city. Okay? So just want the buyer to be aware of that. Property taxes and assessment districts. Tax is payable in two for the tax year, July 1st to June 30th. The first payment is due on November 1st and delinquent after December 10, and the second is due on February 1st and delinquent after April 10. We already know about this from our salesperson class. Okay, this is just to educate the buyer, about Prop 13. And then you have real property transfer taxes and private transfer taxes. That's the stuff we already know. Okay, and it's being put here to remind the buyer how the transfer tax is calculated, and also to remind the buyer in some situation there might be private transfer fees. It's rare, but it could apply in some situations. Okay, this is the one I really want to talk about, and the reason I want to talk about it is because it is a required report in any transaction within the city of San Francisco, including the city of Daly City. Okay, they all require a 3R report. If you've never done any transaction in the city of San Francisco, you are probably new to 3R report. You don't know what a 3R report is. So today you have a chance to hear me talk about the 3R report. If you have a listing in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, you should order your 3R report early. I didn't order my 3R report until this morning. I wish I had ordered it sooner, but hopefully it will not take them too long. Okay, you can order the 3R report online. There's an application form that you have to fill out. You have to fill in the current owner's information, and then you have to fill in your information because if you are the applicant. But you can also make the seller the applicant. However you want to do it's fine. Sometimes for convenience, you may have to make yourself the applicant. Okay? Now, what is a 3R report anyway? You look at 23, it says local law requires that owners of one or more dwelling units obtain and deliver to buyer a report of residential building record prior to selling the property. The Records Management Division of DBI will issue a 3R upon request using the following order form. I did that this morning, and it cost me about $150 for the report. And it says the time to produce the report can be several weeks. So I should have ordered my report sooner, okay? So that you don't want to have to wait for the report while you're trying to close the escrow. So when you have a listing, first thing you do is to order a 3R report. My client did have a 3R report, but it expired. A 3R report has an expiration date. If you don't use it for a long time, it expires, so you have to get a new 3R report. Okay? I ordered it this morning, and I will follow up. Seller is advised to instruct their listing broker agent to order a 3R report on their behalf as soon as the listing agreement is signed. Not after we put it on the MLS, but as soon as the listing agreement is signed, because it does take some time, and I didn't do it sooner. So if it takes several weeks, if I find a buyer today, I open escrow. If escrow closes in a month, I should be fine. Okay, then it will not cause a delay in the close of escrow. Review and approval of the 3R by the buyer is a condition of the purchase agreement. In fact, if you're doing transaction in San Francisco, you probably should not use the CAR form. You probably should use the San Francisco Association of Realtors purchase agreement form, because that is more specific to San Francisco. But if you don't have subscription, which I do have because I'm a member of the San Francisco Association of Realtors, it doesn't cost me extra. It's part of the package. The body of the report purports to list all building permits for the property, dating back to the original construction. So in a way, it is good. Don't you wish that every city has a 3R report so that upon signing of listing in that city, you can actually order a report, and then you'll be able to give that to the buyer and say, okay, these are the permit situation concerning the property that you have. Okay? Iris, I guess you Siping, you need to mute yourself, okay? Next time. All right, going back to the 3R report. So you know that the 3R report contains all the building permits of the property dating back to the original construction. Wow, that's really awesome because my building is 1908, survived the earthquake, okay? So I guess one of my marketing thing will be that it survived earthquake, so it's got to be very strong, right? Okay. However, if the original construction was prior to April 1906 earthquake, that permit will not be shown. Okay, so my building is 1908, so it's after the 1906 earthquake. So hopefully I'll get the permit in my 3R report when I get it. Okay, as the building department lost its records in the fire which followed, so anything previous to 1908, 1906, you might not have it because the record was lost. But after 1906, yes, it should have it. Okay? The 3R report does not include permits for electrical or plumbing work. Okay, that's another important aspect about the 3R report. It does not contain the permits for electrical or plumbing. Those DBI departments maintain their own permit history. Okay. What else is contained in the 3R report? The codes on the line items are explained on the second page of the report. Note, however, that all permits prior to 1950 will show as new rather than completed, as the city did not issue job cards or record the final completion permitted work prior to that time. So if you have applied for permit prior to 1950, the permit will show as new and not completed because back in those days, there's no such a thing as signature card. So, you just know that there was a permit issue, but you just don't know if the work was completed. But after 1950, once they start using the signature card or the completion card, then you will have record that indicates whether the job was completed or not. They call it the job cards, not the signature card, but the job cards. Okay. The report also shows the original and current permitted use of the building as an M family. The report also shows the original and current permitted use of the building as an M family dwelling. The current permitted use shown on a 3R has more credence with the planning department than the assessor's records. So if you're trying to apply something through the planning department, for example, to add a second story or whatever, they actually give more credence to the 3R report than they do the assessor's record. So something that's good to know. If the permitted use is missing or unknown, buyer should contact the department and inquire whether or not this can be corrected or otherwise addressed prior to removing buyer's contingencies. So if your buyer receives the 3R report and is not satisfied with the 3R report because a permitted use is missing or unknown, then the buyer needs to go see the building and safety department and clarify this before the buyer removes their contingencies. The accuracy of the 3R report is less than 100% as records have been lost, misfiled, or not copied accurately over the years. So they are telling you that there may be, you might not have 100% accuracy in the 3R report. If the existence or absence of a particular permit is important, then buyer should obtain a qualified permit researcher to investigate further. So this is to advise the buyer that if they read the 3R report and they have a question about whether a permit exists or not, it's not clear from 3R report, then they should hire a qualified person to research the issue further. Real estate agents are not required to do the research. A 3R report is not a guarantee that the work performed under any of the listed was done in compliance with applicable laws. Okay, so that's another information is that the buyer should be aware that the 3R report does not guarantee that the work performed was done in compliance with applicable law. It only shows that, okay, work was permitted, but if they don't have a job card, we have no idea if the job was completed or not. All the pre-1950 work is not is without a job card. You only start a job card after 1950. Permit issues, this is nothing new except that, in San Francisco, it's common to have the in-law, what they call the in-law unit. So it says some improvements to property such as repairs, remodels, and additions may have been done without a required permit. One such example would be where an additional living area in-law is being rented by the seller but required permits were not obtained for it. So sometimes when you buy a house in San Francisco, you may have the in-law unit, but the in-law unit may not be permitted. So this is just to make the buyer aware of that. Okay? An improvement that is made without the required permit can, among other things, have a negative impact on value, lending, or appraisal. I can tell you one thing now. Sometimes the unpermitted unit can have an impact on the appraisal to a point where it might cause a delay, okay, in getting your loan approved. Just anticipate that. So if you are dealing with a unpermitted, a house with unpermitted construction, you need to advise your buyer that sometimes the unpermitted condition could have an impact on the appraisal. That will cause a delay, especially when you're doing a stated income loan. Okay? Stated income loan, they tend to scrutinize very, very closely. Okay? And it may require a retrofit, impact habitability, especially when you're trying to rent it. Tenant may find out that the rental unit is not permitted and may cause you a problem later on. Preclude insurance coverage, so be aware that, you have unpermitted construction, sometimes you can have issue with insurance coverage. Results in fees, penalties, government and civil enforcement action. Yeah, that could happen too. I have seen it happen many times, okay? Especially in big cities like San Francisco, where they tend to look after the interests of the tenants. So there are also significant restrictions affecting the owner's right to construct or improve garages in San Francisco. Therefore, if a buyer wants to build a garage or alter an existing one, buyer is strongly advised to consult a qualified architect, engineer, or contractor before removing any inspection contingencies. So basically, this is to advise the buyer that if you plan to reconstruct the garage or do something about the garage, or you want to build a garage, in San Francisco, they may have very strict requirements that you need to be aware of before you remove your contingencies. Non-conforming rooms, alterations, or additions. Non-conforming means you are not doing it in accordance with the city's uh, city ordinance. Okay, and uh, and there was no certificate of completion. This is to warn the buyer that if you have non-conforming improvement on your property, they may be subject to removal by local building inspection and code enforcement agency. What that means is, if they found out you have non-conforming improvement, you could face problem from the city. Non-conforming rental units may be required to be vacated and possibly removed. So if you have a unit that is not non-conforming, the city can actually force you to vacate the property and then have that non-conforming unit removed. Okay? So if you're buying such a unit, that's a risk you have to take. Okay? Now, how big of a risk that is, it's not a huge risk, but it is a risk. You may not be able to legalize the non-conforming improvement. This is to warn the buyer. Also, it says here, while sellers are obligated to disclose any known non-conforming improvement, seller may not be aware of some of these illegal improvements. So that's a true statement. Code compliance and enforcement. This is to advise the buyer that, if the property is not a new building, there may be some components or structures that do not meet the code. So that's a risk that the buyer is taking. Number 27, rent and eviction control ordinance. Now, if you're in San Francisco, now pay attention, okay? Because I think this may be helpful to you if you have an investor or you yourself wants to invest in the San Francisco area. It says on June 13, 1979, the San Francisco Residential Rent Stabilization and Arbitration Ordinance was signed into law, which reestablished rent control in San Francisco. Buildings constructed after that date were exempted in order not to discourage new construction. Owner-occupied buildings of 4 units or less were exempt, and an annual rent increase limit was intended to be set annually by the Board of Supervisors in the range of 4% to 7%. So when they passed the law in 1979, they created an exception. Any new construction after 1979 is not subject to rent control. Any owner-occupied buildings of 4 units or less is not subject to rent control. The last 2 provisions were changed by the passing of a ballot measure in November 1992, so that now all pre-June 13, 1979 buildings are included, whether owner-occupied or not. And annual rent increases are limited to 60% of the Bay Area Consumer Price Index. So initially, they actually excluded the owner-occupied 4 units or less. But then in 1992, they included owner-occupied units of owner-occupied 4 units or less. Okay. And then they actually go with 60% of the CPI, the Bay Area CPI. The allowable annual rent increases are published in this website. So if you want to know what is the current allowable rent increase, you can go to this website. Okay. In order to in addition to limiting the amount of rent increases, rent ordinance also limits the right of a landlord to terminate tenancy to circumstances where a just cause reason is present. So not only did they restrict the rent increase, they also restrict eviction. In order for you to evict your tenant, there must be just cause. What are the just cause reasons? There are 16 of them. I don't have time to go over them one by one, but I will tell you the ones that are most commonly used. One of the just cause reasons is you're the owner, you want to move into that unit. It's called owner move in. You have an owner move in situation, you have the right to end the tenancy and move in. Okay? Now, among the 16 just cause reasons is non-payment of rent. So if your tenant is not paying rent, you can evict tenant. Breach of a lease covenant. That means that if there is some sort of a restriction on the lease that the tenant has violated, you may be able to evict the tenant. For example, you may have a situation where the tenant grows marijuana. Of course, the tenant grows marijuana on the property. Even if you don't have any restriction in the lease, it's a violation of federal law. You may be able to evict the tenant. Okay. Creating or permitting nuisance, that's growing marijuana. Breach of a lease covenant, that may have something to do with, for example, the tenant is not a disabled person, doesn't need a pet to keep the tenant company, and the tenant has a pet, and there's a no pet clause in the lease. That's a violation of a lease covenant. The tenant may be evicted. Owner move-in, I told you about owner move-in. Invocation of the Alice Act. Many of you don't know what an Alice Act is, and it will take me a long time to educate you on Alice Act. I'll briefly tell you though. Alice Act allows a owner of a rent control property to remove the rent control property from the market. Simply remove it. Okay? And after a certain period of time, that property may not be subject to rent control. Okay? So if you invoke Alice Act, you can evict the tenant. It means that you decide to quit the rental business and simply wants the property off the rental market. That's what Alice Act is. Now, terminating the tenancy of a rent control tenant in San Francisco can be very difficult, and landlords can incur significant liability for wrongful endeavors to do so. I can tell you though, if you have the wrong motive to evict the tenant and the court finds out about it, there will be severe financial punishment. If you want to buy a property in San Francisco, be aware. Do not evict the tenant unless you have a just cause. You make up a fake just cause, such as an owner move-in, and you don't move in, and the tenant finds out about it, they hire a tenant's rights attorney, they file a lawsuit, you could face a lot of financial losses. Be very, very careful about not abusing any of the 16 just cause reasons. Therefore, the property is occupied by tenants. Buyers are urged to consult with a qualified real estate attorney who specializes in landlord-tenant issues in San Francisco. Over the years, I have educated myself on rent control issues in San Francisco, so I consider myself a knowledgeable attorney when it comes to rent control issues in San Francisco. I handle a lot of San Francisco evictions. Okay. The rent ordinance also requires a seller of a building containing two or more residential units, one or more of which will be delivered vacant at the close of escrow, disclose the legal grounds for the termination of the tenancy in vacant unit, and whether the unit was occupied by an elderly or disabled tenant at the time the tenancy was terminated. Wow. So if you have a listing of a duplex, two or more, so it could be a duplex, a triplex, right? Or a fourplex, because it's two or more. And you are selling the property vacant, the law requires that the seller disclose the legal ground for termination of the vacancy of the tenancy in the vacant unit, and whether it was occupied by elderly and disabled person at the time the tenancy was terminated. So it is a special form. It says CSFCA BUDISSF. It's a special form, so you need to get this form. If you're not a member, you can certainly find this form at the rent board, because such termination can affect the use of vacant rental units even after the sale. Buyer is again urged to consult a qualified real estate attorney. Okay, so if your buyer is buying a two or more units, be aware. And if you're a listing agent of two or more units, be aware. Okay? But this is talking about multi-family now. If it's just a single condominium, this requirement does not apply. The rent ordinance is a very important document that you need to understand before you start transacting in San Francisco. You can get a copy of it by going to this website. The above described limitations do not constitute an exhaustive list of all the restrictions imposed by rent control, rent ordinance. So they want you basically saying that the list that they give you above is not the complete list. Okay? Let's talk about the tenant security deposits. And that's important because if you're buying a rental property, you need to know that landlords may collect a security deposit from tenants not to exceed 2 months' rent for unfurnished units and 3 months' rent for furnished units. You learn this thing from the salesperson class. All amounts held, whether described as key deposits, last month's rent, pet deposit, are included in the definition of security deposit. The handling of security deposit is primarily governed by state law. And upon departure of tenant, security deposit must be returned within 21 days. I'm sure all of you know about this rule. Okay? Any deduction must be itemized and made pursuant to the specific procedures. I will not go over this. But a landlord needs to know that you have to pay simple interest on all security deposits held for at least 1 year. Okay? And the rate for the interest is published by the rent board. So go to the rent board's website to figure out what the interest rate is that you have to apply to the tenant security deposit that you have to pay the tenant. Apartment license fees and rent ordinance fees. DBI recovers part of its cost by charging apartment license fee to owners of 3-unit or larger apartment buildings, condominiums. This fee is added to the property tax bill annually. So just know that, in addition to a property tax bill, if you have 3-unit or larger apartment buildings, you have to pay what they call the apartment license fees. Okay? The rent board recovers part of its operating cost through a permit fee charged to landlords for each residential dwelling unit subject to the rent ordinance. So if you have a rent control property, you may be required to pay a permit fee, okay? Just bear in mind, all right? The fee is added to the property tax bill annually. 50% of the fee may be charged to the tenant living on the unit on November 1st of each year, either billed to them or deducted from their security deposit interest. So even though you have to pay for it through your property tax bill, you may be able to recover 50% of it from your tenant. Number 30, owner move-in. I can tell you this is absolutely my favorite subject. I dealt with so many owner move-in situations in San Francisco. There's a lot of ins and outs to this. My favorite topic for sure. Okay, owner and relative move-in. Yeah, I know. I can tell you what you can do and what you can't do. The rent ordinance authorizes an owner to evict a tenant from a rental unit in order to live there as his or her personal residence. So if you have a rental unit, you can actually end the tenancy by moving onto the property. That's a right you have. However, the rent ordinance restricts the right of an owner to do so in a number of material respects, and also sets forth the stringent legal and notice requirement related to which buyers strongly recommended to consult with a qualified real estate attorney specializing in San Francisco landlord-tenant law. Now, if you want to do an owner move-in eviction, even the notice itself requires an expert to draft it for you. You don't have a car form for this kind of notice. So you need to consult an experienced lawyer such as myself on what kind of language you have to put into the owner move-in eviction notice, not just your ordinary eviction notice. For example, the owner move-in eviction requires an owner intend to occupy the unit as his or her principal place of residence for at least 36 continuous months. Now, let's say, for example, you decide to evict the tenant based on owner move-in, and after 24 months, you decide to rent it again. Now you got a problem because you're supposed to rent it out. You're supposed to occupy it for at least 3 years. So don't move out until you're satisfied the 3-year requirement. Okay. Also, the rent ordinance generally only allows an OMI eviction from one unit in the property. Yeah, let's say you got 4 units. You cannot evict both units, two or more units, and tell them that you're going to move in. It doesn't make any sense because it's only you, right? So it says only allows an OMI eviction from one unit in the property. If there has been a prior OMI eviction, buyer generally may not do an OMI eviction after December 18, 1998 from any unit in the property except the one specific unit that was of the prior eviction. So let's say, for example, you got 4 units, and previously the previous owner has exercised the OMI eviction on unit A, and you got A, B, C, and D. Okay, there has been a prior OMI on unit A, and then you sell it. You sell the 4 units to the next owner. Can the next owner end the tenancy on either B, C, or D? No. There can only be one specific unit, if you have multi-units, that the owner can use, okay, as OMI. Okay, that's another restriction. So that's also another favorite topic of mine. I handle this type of situation quite a bit. The rent ordinance also generally prohibits an owner from doing an OMI eviction if any tenant in the unit is 60 years of age or older and has lived in the unit for at least 10 years. Or two, is disabled, qualified to receive SSI, and has lived in the unit for at least 10 years. And three, is catastrophically ill and has lived in the unit for at least 5 years. So there are three kinds of tenants for which you cannot do an OMI eviction. One is 60 plus and lived there for 10 years. Another one is disabled and has lived there for 10 years. Another one is very, very ill, extremely ill, okay, and has lived there for at least 5 years. So if you have any such individual tenant in the unit, if you are a buyer considering whether to buy it to live in there and decide whether you need to do an eviction, if you can't do an eviction, you're stuck with the tenant. If it's one of these three situations, you're stuck with the tenant. Even if you want to move in, you can't move in if your tenant belongs to one of these three categories. Okay? Good to know. This type of tenant is what we call protected tenant, all right? So make sure you don't have any protected tenant. The rent ordinance provides further definition of what does or what does not qualify an occupant as a protected tenant for purposes of an OMI. There are many other limitations on evictions, including but not limited to provisions governing timing of eviction notice, where a minor child is in occupancy and the above is not intended to be an exhaustive list. Now, it's not on this form here, but I'll tell you though. If in a household you got a kid that is going to school and that person is no more than 14 years old, the timing of the notice becomes important. Your notice cannot expire before the summer holidays, before they're out of school. So you have to time your notice perfectly so that by the time your notice expires, it's during the summer when they're out of school or when they are not attending classes. Okay? I know about this rule too. In addition to authorizing OMI evictions, the rent ordinance allows relative move-in. Now, if you don't want to move in, one of your relatives want to move in, that works too. But the above rules would apply. Relative move-in evictions in certain circumstances. The RMI eviction is also subject to a number of significant restrictions as well as legal and notice requirements. For example, an RMI can generally be done for certain relatives. Not every relative. For example, the distant relatives will not qualify for RMI. Only the immediate relatives. For example, the landlord's grandparents, grandchildren, parents, children, brother, sister, or the landlord's spouse, or the spouses of such relations. So it's pretty broad actually. So if you have a brother or sister who wants to move in, no problem, qualify, right? Your kid wants to move in, no problem, qualifies. Your parents want to move in, no problem, qualify. Your grandparents want to move in, no problem, that will qualify. So a lot of relatives will qualify under the RMI. Okay. Okay. Who intend to occupy the unit as their principal residence for at least 36 months. I talked about that, right? Further, an RMI can generally only be if the owner either lives in the property or is simultaneously pursuing an OMI eviction to evict a tenant from another in the property. You know, the RMI can move into one unit. It says here, it can generally only be if the owner either lives in the property or is simultaneously pursuing an RMI, OMI eviction to evict a tenant from another in the property. So basically what you're saying is that, on top of RMI, you can have an OMI, okay? There are many additional limitations on owner's right to pursue an RMI eviction, including but not limited to provisions concerning the timing of RMI eviction notice, where the minor child is in occupancy. Same thing, if the guy is in school, you got a minor child in school, you have to wait until they're out of school before they can be evicted. Okay, that's another restriction. Whether proceeding with either an OMI or an RMI eviction, the owner is required to pay relocation payment. Now, don't forget, after you buy, you need to evict, you have to pay them relocation payment. Usually, we pay 50% upfront, 50% when they give us the key. In San Francisco, each occupant is entitled to something like $5,500. I don't know if they raised it. Okay, so if you have 5 occupants, it's 5,000, 5,500 times 5. But there is a household limit. I can't remember what the household limit. The last time I dealt with it, it was close to 20,000 per household. Okay. All right. Once an RMI or OMI is completed, owner will have limitation on re-rental and certain reporting requirements. So let's say, for example, you decide to do an owner move-in. You cannot do re-rental, obviously, right? Because you have to live there for 36 months. And also, you may have to file certain reports with the rent board during the time that you live there as the owner. If the owner seeks to re-rent the unit during the 5-year period after the OMI, RMI notice was served, the evicted tenant has a right of first refusal. Let's say, for example, after you live there for 36 months, you decide to put it on the market, but it's less than 5 years after you moved in. As long as it's less than 5 years, you have to give your previously occupying tenant a right of first refusal before you rent it to somebody else, should you decide to re-rent it after 5 years. No, after within 5 years, but after 3 years. Okay. All right, this is another, and then you see the penalty is $250 for first violation and $1,000 for subsequent violation. Actually, if this results in a lawsuit, the penalty is a lot higher than that. This is considered cheap. Okay. There are some laws out there that can cause the landlord to lose a fortune if they don't abide by the rent ordinance. Relocation payment, they're basically telling you that, you have to pay relocation to the tenants. Now, tenant buyout, sometimes you may be able to negotiate a tenant buyout. I have helped a few clients negotiate tenant buyout. You can do that. Tenant buyout usually require that you pay more than the relocation payment, or else why should the tenant let you buy them out? So any kind of tenant buyout will cost your client more money than the relocation expense. Okay. All right, I'll keep going. Alice Act eviction, I told you before. Alice Act means that it says here, as an alternative to continuing to rent units in the property, buyer can choose to terminate the tenancies of all occupied rental units by invoking Alice Act. So what is Alice Act? It means you simply remove the property from the market. That's what an Alice Act means. It means that you remove it and let it sit there, and you're not renting it. That's called Alice Act. There are certain requirements that have to be met if you want to invoke Alice Act. Okay. Short-term residential rental. In San Francisco, there are many Airbnb. So the city actually has, they do allow Airbnb. If you look at it, it says the city of San Francisco regulates what is supposed to be short-term residential rentals facilitated by companies such as Airbnb. Currently, that law allows property owners and tenants to conduct short-term residential rentals without violating the requirements of city's residential unit conversion and demolition ordinance. A short-term residential rental for purposes of that law is of all or portion of a residential unit for less than 30 nights. So any short-term less than 30 nights by Airbnb fits the definition of short-term residential rental. To engage in such rentals under the law, eligible permanent resident owners and tenants must apply to place their residential unit on the Office of Short-Term Residential Rental Registry. So in order to operate Airbnb, you have to call this number or go to this website. Okay? Seller occupancy after close of escrow. Says here, under the rent ordinance, a seller of real property who continues to occupy the property after the close of escrow may acquire tenant's rights, which may make it difficult for the buyer to recover possession of the newly purchased property if a dispute arises before the seller vacates. So if you are going to be buying a property in San Francisco, now if you're doing rent back to the seller, be careful. Don't rent back more than 30 days. If you rent back more than 30 days, the seller will be converted into a tenant. And they have all kinds of tenants' rights that you don't want to deal with. So in San Francisco, rent back, try to keep it less than 30 days, okay? Condominium conversion ordinance. Currently, my listing is actually a condominium conversion. Okay, now this is actually a good class for you guys because you can actually be educated on condominium conversion, okay? I'll teach you a little bit about condominium conversion because I have all of the information right in front of me. Okay. If you don't know what a condo conversion is, it says here, since 1982, local laws in San Francisco have severely limited the conversion of apartment buildings to condominiums. No buildings containing 7 or more residential units could be converted. So no, they don't allow any condo conversion if you have 7 or more units. That's good to know. And the lottery system was in place, allowing no more than 200 units to be created annually from 26-unit apartment buildings. They call it the lottery now. So you know, they allow no more than 200 units to be created annually from 26 apartment buildings. So out of the 26 apartment buildings, each year they only allow a total of 26 apartment buildings, but no more than 200 units for conversion. So no more than 26 units, but no more than, no more than 26 apartment buildings, but no more than 200 units allowed each year. And then there are so many of them in the San Francisco area. So you have to be lucky to be given the right to do a condo conversion. And my client actually participated in the lottery, and they won the lottery. So they are able to convert their 4 units into a condo conversion. That is called the lottery. Okay, that's one way to convert your apartment buildings into a condominium. The only exemptions to the lottery system were 2-unit buildings with both units owner-occupied. So if you don't want to go through the lottery, your building must not be more than 2 units. Then you don't have to go through the lottery. Such buildings could bypass the lottery and begin the conversion process after both units had been simultaneously owner-occupied for a year. So let's say you own a duplex in San Francisco. One of them you occupy, the other one is tenant-occupied. And after you get rid of that tenant, it's a duplex. You decide that it makes sense to convert into a condominium. The way to do it will be to get rid of that tenant in the rental unit and occupy both units for a year. And then You don't have to go through the lottery. You can actually do what they call the bypass, okay? And then you can convert both units. That's a lot simpler. In June of 2013, a new ordinance was passed suspending the lottery system for 10 to 12 years and further restricting entry into it. If and when it does resume, okay, now the problem becomes more severe. If you have never participated in a lottery, they suspended the lottery system. So in other words, if you try to do it after 2013, you might not be able to do it. So, if your client intends to buy a, let's say 4 units with the intention to participate in the lottery, to convert it into a condominium, no chance, because right now it's suspended, right? Those restrictions include eliminating all buildings with more than 4 residential and increasing the owner occupancy requirements for 3 and 4 unit buildings, such that any building entering the lottery can only have 1 unit with a tenant in place. So yes, you can see more restriction now. In the interim, a schedule of permissions to convert for buildings which have met prior requirements to enter the lottery has been created. New conversion fees of as much as $20,000 are charged, and lifetime leases must be offered. $20,000 might seem like a lot of money to most of us, but to San Franciscans, it's called nothing. Okay, and I tell you, many of them will still tell you it's worth it. Okay, that goes to show how valuable properties are in the San Francisco area. I'm sure my client paid $20,000. Okay, for the conversion fee. Okay, it's a lot of money. All right, I'll skip. TIC, in San Francisco, sometimes you have the TIC, okay? That's tenants in common. In fact, it's quite common in San Francisco for people to sell TIC. So when you're in San Francisco, now if you have a seller who is selling TIC, there are special forms for you to use to sell TIC. So don't use the car form. Car form doesn't work for sale of TIC. It's a special form, okay? Now that. Square footage disclosure, we already know about that. I'm going to skip that, okay? HOA, looks like we still have a lot to cover. So instead of rushing through it, I'm going to continue with next week so we can finish all of these disclosures next week. So there'll be a part 2 of San Francisco disclosures and advisories. Okay? All right. See you guys next week.